Before we start this video, let me ask you two questions. How much of a character can you change before it becomes completely unrecognizable as the character it was supposed to be? And how much of a story can be rewritten before it is no longer the story you are retelling? Hello everyone, this is Callimara here, and no, it's not calamari. Welcome back to the channel, or if you're new to the pond, go ahead and take a dive. You might like it here. This video is a little different from others I've done before or have done in a while. While I've provided commentary on various media before, I've only ever done so by focusing on one specific media. I've never really looked at an entire landscape of a genre before, but that's what I will be doing in this video. While I'll be pulling specific examples, certainly, it's not meant to be a criticism of the work specifically, even if some examples may deserve it more than others. I more so want to explore some personal reasons on why I dislike myth retellings, because for one reason or another, they've become rather prevalent on my online feeds and it rankles me. Think of this as a musing, not so much a rant, because at the end of this video, there will be no conclusive answer, nor a dictation on what is the right or wrong way to do things. Just some food for thought, and perhaps some considerations for you to carry when creating your own reimaginings. First, let's figure out what is a myth retelling. According to the Grattan Street Press, a myth retelling is essentially a new version of a classic myth that incorporates modern themes and perspectives. When creating a myth retelling, the University of Pennsylvania writes, the author may borrow from the original myth while changing other elements, take creative liberties with the story, and even change the genre, style, or narrative point of view. And while I dislike it, I acknowledge that myth retellings do have their importance and place in the world of literature. Not only because it makes mythology more accessible to the general public, but they also challenge biases and question traditional narratives. They provide visibility to marginalized perspectives, help readers reconsider traditional mythological narratives, and provide different perspectives. So, why do I dislike it? As myth retellings are often written by people outside of the creation of the source material, the interpretation of the characters, the story and messages are similarly affected by the new author's worldviews, personal biases, and life experiences. So while the very purpose of a myth retelling is to challenge biases and question traditional narratives, the retelling itself is also subject to the author's biases and motives, which in turn affects their interpretation of the source material, and in essence, we're simply trading one person's bias for another, trusting that their interpretation is correct and accepting it as our own, and for some, without even necessarily knowing the source material at all. And that's where the first wrench comes in. Let's consider the first two questions I asked in the beginning of this video. Given the very nature of a retelling is to simply borrow from the original myth, to change parts of it and take creative liberties with the story, the question that comes into my mind is, how much of a character can you change before it becomes completely unrecognizable as the character it was supposed to be, until all that remains of the character is a name or broad strokes of how they came to be? Where is the line between a character being reimagined and an original character? As a content creator whose entire channel is dedicated to redesigning and rewriting characters from various media, it's a question I ask myself constantly. How much of this character's story and appearance can I change before I've essentially just created an OC? How much of the context they originate from can I modify before I've created my own original setting and premise? Perhaps if you were around on Tumblr in the early 2010s, you might be familiar with this guy. And in case you weren't, this guy is known as the Onceler. The Onceler himself is a reimagining of the Onceler from Dr. Seuss's book, The Lorax. In the book, we don't really see the Onceler at all. All we really see of him are his green arms. In the movie released in 2012, the Onceler, however, is a full man, one with a sympathetic backstory, a family, and a design that was a huge hit with the female demographic of the movie's target audience. That being tweens and young kids. And where were most tweens and young kids hanging out online in 2012? That's right, Tumblr. And so this character, who was already a reimagining, was further reimagined into various different versions of himself with vastly different designs and convoluted backstories to the 2012's The Lorax Onceler. Some not even adhering to the Lorax setting at all. And no, we don't really need to get into the fact that all these different versions of himself were also in relationships with each other, because that is not relevant. But you're probably wondering at this point why this is relevant to myth retellings. And the reason I bring it up is, at what point is a reimagining just an original character? At what point are we simply following the story of the author's OC with only a name, a setting, and the guise of similar plot points to tie it to the pre-existing IP in which it claims to belong? In essence, retellings or reimaginings to me are professionally published fanfiction, like some may argue of the Telogony to the Odyssey. The Telogony? Telogony? Two pieces of classical Greek myth literature, set as a direct continuation of the other, but written by two completely different authors with no relation to each other in their work, vicinity, nor time period. The Odyssey, which you might all be incredibly familiar with now thanks to its widely successful musical reimagining, Epic the Musical, was originally written by Homer around 750 to 650 BCE. The Telogony, or Telogony, is most commonly agreed to have been written by Eugamon of Cyrene, and at earliest was written a century after the Odyssey in 570 BC, but is still considered the direct continuation of Odysseus' story and the events that unfold after his homecoming. It is also notoriously much less palatable to the modern reader. Two different time periods, two different authors who never interacted, never exchanged ideas or traded visions for their hopes and expectations regarding the work in question. How canon could such a story be under these circumstances? What differentiates it from a teenager writing fanfiction of their favorite book and publishing it on AO3 or fanfiction.net? Technically speaking, anyone could write a continuation of a classic or a retelling of an already existing IP, and lots of people do. I mean, that's how we got 50 Shades of Grey, which, in case some of you guys didn't know, originally started out as a Twilight fanfiction, especially back then, when things like copyright laws and ownership rights didn't exist. Or maybe they did, I don't know, just in different forms. But what makes one less reputable than the other when both are works of fiction? So, is it the reach and success of the work itself? The author's qualifications? Their ties to the original work? I personally think it all goes back to the source, the original author. Was the new author specifically appointed to continue their story? Were they the original author's student? What ties did the new author have to the original creator? How well did they know the original author's work and their intentions with it? These things become skewed the further the new author is from the original. It's a basic research principle. Always use primary sources. Secondary information will be skewed by the person you receive information from, who has already processed their findings through their own thinking frameworks and the lens of their personal biases. But then again, how much does the original author's intentions even matter when the story has become public and is now in the hands of the reader? Some may say it matters completely because it is the correct way to interpret the story. Some might say it doesn't matter at all because what matters is how the reader themselves interpret it. So perhaps it should fall back on the work's success, such that even if the Telogony were not written by Homer, and perhaps was never intended by Homer to be part of his epic, its mainstream acceptance by the people who read it at the time and the historians that rediscovered it now has made it an indisputable part of the epic cycle regardless. But maybe that may change one day, who knows? I personally find it amusing because this sets a precedent in human culture, and that one day in the far, far future, when copyright laws don't apply or exist anymore, historians will rediscover the Percy Jackson books and consider them an actual part of Greek mythology. And here's the second wrench. How dependent is the retelling on the original? Can you read it on its own merit? Or does it still require you to read the source material in order to have full context? I personally dislike stories, especially ones intended as a standalone, that rely heavily on the audience having prior knowledge of the source material because it allows the new author to put in less work. Because it can be done right, but if you expect me to feel any sort of excitement just for doing the bare minimum of showing a person from your source material in the scene or mentioning them in the story, you are sorely mistaken. Superhero movies are probably the biggest culprit of this because they have so many characters across different comics that occur in the same setting. You can argue that their inclusion in the reimagining or new format is meant for the actual fans of the IP, people who do already have prior knowledge of the story and characters, and that it's good not to appeal to the mainstream audience, and I would agree. But also, if I were a fan and my favorite character gets included, but all the inclusion they got was walking on screen, smirking, throwing a single punch, and then immediately getting killed off, I would be pretty upset. And if I didn't know them, I'd probably just think, well, that was pointless. That character was pointless. For good measure, let's look at another example of a poorly reimagined IP that would probably be better off as an original story. Paul W. S. Anderson's Resident Evil movies. What is even the point of including the characters from the actual Resident Evil games when you're going to have your original character take over their roles and focus anyway? But also, in a way, I respect it more than 2021's Welcome to Raccoon City, which, in my opinion, is just a worse retelling of the story of Resident Evil 2. Because at the very least, Anderson's Resident Evil movies weren't afraid to be exactly what it was. Self-indulgent OC insert fanfiction, and I love that for him. So then, how does this relate to my dislike of myth retelling specifically? Well, myths aren't regular stories that are freely open for interpretation, the likes of action movies or Hollywood blockbusters. Be it religious or cultural, they are stories with significantly more value because to the people it belongs to, it is as big a part of cultural practice as much as it is a preservation of history, their history. They are the stories people told to teach lessons or understand the world from their cultural lens. And I believe such a thing should not be attempted to be reinterpreted by people outside the culture who do not have full understanding of it, lest we get products like Raya and the Last Dragon, which I've already spoken extensively about before. But Greek myth is in a bit of a gray area because while it is a myth tied to both Greek culture and its ancient religion, it is also considered public domain due to how far it has spread outside of Greece and ingrained itself into the cultures of many others, carved into buildings and infrastructure in countries located hundreds of kilometers away with vastly different cultures and their own beliefs, yet somehow becoming inextricably entwined with it all the same. In a sense, making it open for anyone to interact with in a way, for instance, Indonesian mythology is not. It is classical art, the foundation that all artists must learn from. It belongs to everyone, and so anyone is free to make it their own. Such is the drawback of opening your culture for the world to interact and live in it. It is to be known throughout the world, but to be known by the world is to belong to it. One can only hope it retains its roots as having been your people's. And that's the gray line I want to walk today. The Song of Achilles, which most would agree is an example of a myth retelling done right, is still not without its flaws when it comes to the narrative decisions made by its author. While I commend Miller for her bold and unapologetic retelling of Achilles and Patroclus' romance, shedding light upon and providing powerful, earnest representation for same-sex relationships that is still difficult to find even in this modern age of media. It explores what historians and scholars have traditionally glossed over or even dismissed with an air of reductive neutrality despite its role as the heart and soul, the instigating event, the who and why of the Iliad itself, and in doing so provides the context previously missing for the quasi-divine wrath Achilles felt upon his loss. The Iliad itself, in essence, is nothing more than the fallout of the loss of said love and the guilt that lingers within Achilles for being part of the reason for it. This is something that is also showcased clearly and unabashedly in the game Hades, which in itself is also a myth retelling that I actually enjoy and am a huge fan of. So why do both still fail to convince me that myth retellings would be enjoyable for me to consume? Because the area in which both Hades and the Song of Achilles disappoints me is the creative liberty the writers took when it came to the two women central to Achilles' life, his mother Thetis and his wife Deidamia. In the Song of Achilles, Thetis and Deidamia are reinterpreted as antagonists to Patroclus and Achilles' blossoming relationship. Thetis, as opposed to being a caring mother who did everything she could to protect her son after receiving a prophecy of him perishing in war, going through lengths to dip him in the river Styx, and begged for him not to go out of love for him, was reinterpreted as a cunning schemer, pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating the events that unfolded like a controlling puppeteer who only wants an heir from Achilles. Deidamia was portrayed as unsophisticated, who was hateful and abusive towards Patroclus out of jealousy, who did not truly love Achilles but rather loved the idea of him, and only married him because she was tricked by Thetis into believing it would help her fulfill her own dreams and goals. Hades the game fails to mention either of their existences at all. In a way, I can forgive this decision, as the Song of Achilles is told from Patroclus' perspective, just as Hades is told from Zagreus', and both characters are unreliable narrators who are not all-knowing. As his love and the person he is devoted to, Patroclus would naturally view Achilles favorably regardless of his actions, ignoring red flags because his feelings for him override his common sense, and thus he views anything and anyone who stands in the way of his love as antagonistic. Except Thetis and Deidamia's roles as antagonists are validated by the story itself, and Patroclus is justified in feeling this way because the narrative proves that his thoughts and assumptions when it comes to them are accurate and correct, and not just the reader's perception of Deidamia and Thetis being skewed by Patroclus' own biases. The book also gives Achilles something of the Onceler treatment, wherein the original Onceler by Dr. Seuss was very much an unsympathetic character who thrived on greed and acted because of it. There was nothing deeper behind his motivations aside from that. The same goes for Achilles, who himself is not a great character, who has committed many crimes and done heinous things. And in both their adaptations, they were made more sympathetic by having characters around them who were arguably worse and influencing their actions, such that the actions they took are no longer their own decisions. Hades, meanwhile, is told from Zagreus' perspective, who views Achilles as both his mentor and the father figure he never found in his biological father Hades. He uncovers Achilles' story alongside the player, a story in which Achilles pointedly never even mentions his wife or son, or if they even existed in this particular retelling. And at that point, we too already possess a favorable view of Achilles, such that whatever crimes he laments committing while he was alive ceases to matter. This is a common pitfall I mostly see in fandom spaces where male-x-male ships have become the main focus of the media, where in an attempt to put a spotlight on gay representation, they will accidentally pivot to misogyny towards existing female characters that may stand in the way of the two male characters being together, simply by being a potential love interest as well. If you yourself are in fandom spaces, you may notice how some fans may unintentionally utilize tactics men did throughout history to downplay, minimize, and/or outright erase women's roles in major events, or their relations and significance to other characters, either by giving the credit to the men or quietly leaving out the parts where the women were involved. Or, if the women are kept in, they're there to be mischaracterized and villainized to invalidate the pre-existing relationship and justify the author's mistreatment of their portrayal as a means to make their abandonment seem more palatable. And then people who know the media exclusively from the fandom just proceed to think that that's what the character is actually like, much like in this question Madeline Miller received about Deidamia. Another argument that is often used against the female characters is that they are poorly written or only serve as accessories to the male lead by misogynistic authors whose writing likely won't pass the Bechdel test, which I'm sure is true for some, if not most cases. But I would say 8 times out of 10, the male characters they've chosen as the new love interest are also of a similar quality, simply serving as an accessory to the lead, wherein most of their profound characterization comes from the fandom. Maybe it's just me, but I certainly don't see nearly as many analyses or essays dissecting female characters and their nuances compared to male characters, unless the cast of the show is exclusively or predominantly female, which, I mean, they kind of have to at that point. And in turn, this whether intentionally or not, creates the image that a certain piece of media is male exclusive and female exclusionary, when the irony is that the fandom space will be predominantly women. And to me, unfortunately, the Song of Achilles and Hades has fallen into this same pitfall in regards to Patroclus and Achilles' relationship. Because what often gets overlooked when reintroducing their relationship in the modern age is the fact that it is inextricably tied to Achilles being unfaithful and Patroclus being a willing participant, which, while it was acceptable for two men in ancient Greece to be lovers despite already being married to a woman and having a family with her, not because of any gay acceptance or progressiveness, mind, but rather a deep-seated hatred towards women, wherein wives were considered property as opposed to a partner. This story was written specifically to appeal to a modern audience, where infidelity is much less accepted by today's moral standards, and the perception of what is and isn't infidelity is also much more strict. For example, back then in ancient Greece, if you were sleeping around, as long as you didn't bring the woman to your marital bed, it was still fine and dandy. Or if you did it while you were out of town or in a different kingdom, it was all fair game. But the only way it seems to be addressed is through the previous methods I mentioned. And personally, I think this is a cop-out. If you have to villainize a woman just for standing in the way of your ship, all your arguments for said ship immediately becomes invalid to me. Because of course it would be easier to justify an affair when the person currently in a relationship is being mistreated or is unhappy with their partner. Doubly so if said partner is unlikable to the reader. They may even find it cathartic to see this abusive, unpleasant partner be hurt in return and receive their comeuppance over the way they behaved. On the contrary, if Deidamia had been painted in a better light, if she was kind and loving towards Achilles and is nothing but a devoted wife to him, if she truly loved him, well, that may make Achilles' choice to betray her and Patroclus' determination to pursue Achilles regardless much less palatable to the audience, wouldn't it? Perhaps they would feel more conflicted in supporting his relationship with Patroclus because now their actions are not so easily justified. They've hurt an innocent person who had no choice or control in any of it. But Achilles and Patroclus' relationship, and the way relationships in general are portrayed in classical Greek literature, has always been so. Greek literature is not shy in shedding light on the wrongdoings of every party involved in its stories, even the heroes whom they glorify, the very gods they worship. And I think this ability to operate in shades of gray, that a hero can also be a bad person, and a villain may be doing what was needed, what was right, is an aspect that is often lost in modern retellings, which are too focused on placing things neatly in boxes of good and bad, right and wrong. I personally think this is a disservice to the source material and outright dishonest when you don't acknowledge the bad with the good, opting to sanitize them and then romanticize them for oblivious modern readers who know not of their shadows, because you know, deep down, they would not be as easily accepted in this era, an era that is obsessed with things being only good or only bad. If you didn't. Because that is the biggest challenge when reimagining characters with a legacy, especially ones as old as Greek myth. You must take the good and the bad. And I'm not endorsing harmful elements being featured prominently in literature that was a product of its time to be carried over into modern adaptations just because it was included originally. But when it does become a problem is when it chooses to use its artistic liberty to depict characters in a way that is not only detrimental to them, but also completely contrary to the source material. Because unlike superhero movies or book-to-movie adaptations, Greek myth is also a preservation of history, and it is far too easy for retellings to cross into misinformation, especially when set in the same time period, which in turn snowballs into historical revisionism because the average reader will simply not have the motivation to do their own research on the source material and the cultural landscape around it, though they should, and it is a large part of the reason why I dislike myth retellings. I don't like that ancient Greece now is painted as this progressive utopia where anyone could love anyone, because it really wasn't. It was still just as hateful, if not more so. especially for women. Another much more egregious example of this would be Lore Olympus. I'm sure you know it. I'm sure you've watched the countless video essays discussing the differences between it and the original Hades and Persephone myth and why it is so much worse. But let's focus on the three worst examples of irrational and unnecessary misportrayal: Persephone, Demeter, and Apollo. In Lore Olympus, Persephone is depicted as an extremely naive, sheltered, and vulnerable young goddess. This is a result of her mother's overprotectiveness, who sheltered her all her life and wants her to remain a virgin goddess like Artemis or Athena. Without any additional context, you may be able to get behind the idea that Demeter is unreasonable, unfairly controlling, and does not care for her daughter's autonomy. Perhaps even that Demeter treats Persephone more like an object than a person, and wanting to keep her like a possession. It makes sense why Persephone would try to seek freedom and independence from her mother, to carve out her own path and become her own person, right? But then you do get context, and you learn that the story reimagines Persephone as being only 19 years old. Not 19 in god years, 19 in human years. 19 as a human is still too young, let alone to a god. And on top of that, Persephone is also the only god in the story to still be in their double digits, whereas everyone else is already far into their triple, quadruple, perhaps even pentuple digits. So of course, Demeter would be extremely protective and sheltering of Persephone. To an immortal goddess who has existed for eons, she was literally just born, which unfortunately lends more credence to the allegation that the author infantilized Persephone intentionally, both in design and personality, yet still expects us to accept her relationship with Hades, which now has a much worse power dynamic than even the original myth. And honestly, that is kind of impressive. Additionally, while Zeus isn't explicitly stated to be Persephone's father in this version of the myth, Persephone is often the result of an assault on Demeter. And so, knowing how cruel and unforgiving their world is, she would of course want to shelter her daughter from all that suffering. Yet she is depicted as abusive and unreasonable, her motives being selfishness and a desire to possess Persephone, as opposed to a mother fighting desperately to keep the world from crushing her child's innocence and stealing it away too soon. Does that make the way she went about it right? No. But it is justified considering how women are treated in Greek myths. But also, Persephone was only 19 years old and was likely so sheltered because she was a literal infant living in a god nursery. I remember assuming that when Persephone spoke about being forced to live a sheltered life, it would have been for at least 300 years, which would have made sense to me why she sought independence so desperately. But 19 years is but a blink of an eye to a god. And so this only takes away from Persephone's character, making her seem even more childish and immature, and proving her mother right that she is naive, that she does not know any better, and that she really shouldn't be making her own decisions yet, which further infantilizes her as a character. I feel a 19-year-old human is still too young to make most major life decisions, let alone a 19-year-old god. And now, let's talk about Apollo. Apollo perhaps had the worst reimagining of all the gods in Lore Olympus. Not only is he completely unrecognizable as Apollo from a visual standpoint, he is also unrecognizable in his behavior and personality and even lore. Ironic, considering the title of the series. But perhaps that was an allusion to the author creating their own lore after skimming a Wikipedia page on Greek myth. In Lore Olympus, Apollo is written as overly confident and arrogant to the point of narcissism. He often disregards the feelings and wishes of others and doesn't really seem to care for anyone other than himself. Apollo's ego is inflated to the point where he believes everyone likes him and refuses to believe otherwise. Thus, he often ignores boundaries and consent, and is even shown to be utterly delusional to his surroundings and himself, with a twisted perception of reality. Lore Olympus Apollo is also a compulsive liar who twists the truth and deceives everyone around him, including himself, to get his way. And every single part of this characterization is wrong. Even beyond being inaccurate, it is purposely choosing aspects of his character and making it the complete opposite. It is willfully malicious of a depiction and so far from who Apollo is that he could have been named Steve and it wouldn't have changed a thing. Just Zeus's other son, lesser known god, Steve. This is when myth retellings start to get harmful because I've received comments on my Apollo video being surprised that Apollo was not, in fact, a narcissistic lying rapist who couldn't handle the word no, but in fact, the complete opposite. Apollo is not only the god of truth and rationality, which would make him the complete opposite of a delusional liar who has a warped sense of reality, he is also one of the gods with the least accounts of essay in his myths. And depending on the version of the myth, he has none at all. And part of the reason Apollo is often said to have been rejected so often is because he respects boundaries and the word no. If he didn't, he would have just done what he wanted. He wouldn't have been rejected. Yet somehow, he's a bigger liar, manipulator, and schemer than Hermes, the actual god of lies, trickery, and deceit. As for his arrogance, well, I'll just play a clip from my Apollo video. Were there instances where Apollo simply doled out divine punishment outside of vengeance for his children or others in general? Certainly. And it's actually one I mentioned at the very start of the video, the story of Apollo's contest with the satyr Marsyas. In it, Apollo flays the satyr alive for his hubris, daring to claim that he was superior to the god of music himself. And I know this sounds cruel and vindictive, and I know at this point I'm basically Apollo's defense attorney, but it is only cruel and vindictive without context. See, there are several accounts to consider. The first was that the reason Marsyas ended up being flayed was because he was essentially a sore loser and accused Apollo of cheating for singing while he played his lyre, which was what angered Apollo. Marsyas made a mistake in the competition, playing his flute off-key, and he was the one to suggest his own punishment out of shame. In the third account, Apollo played his lyre upside down while Marsyas could not play his flute upside down, which was how Apollo was declared the victor. But regardless of how the competition went down, Apollo still won and Marsyas still ended up being flayed. However, after the fact, Apollo repented immediately and grew distressed at what he had done. In his distress, he tore the strings of his lyre and threw it away. And let's be honest, not many Greek gods often feel remorseful for their divine punishments. But this lyre was later discovered by the Muses and Apollo's sons Linus and Orpheus. The Muses fixed the middle string, Linus fixed the string struck with the forefinger, and Orpheus fixed the lowest string and the one next to it. They took it back to Apollo, but the god, who had decided to stay away from music for a while, laid away both the lyre and the pipes at Delphi. So, yeah, he's actually super sensitive and, he doesn't like doing the whole divine punishment thing unless his dad tells him to. And this is one of the first myths I learned about in 4th grade, by the way, and it's still one of my favorite myths about Apollo, aside from the one with Hermes when he stole his cows as a 1-day-old baby. But to me, it just shows that Apollo is beautiful inside and out. He is gentle and prefers to create, to heal, to educate over fighting or triumphing over others, and his radiance shines from within. I'm actually a bit unclear about where the characterization that Apollo is vain and full of himself comes from, so if anyone wants to educate me on that, comment down below. It's also incredibly hypocritical for Apollo to be the only god vilified for being possessive, when that is a common vice for every god, and yet the author chose to depict it only in him. And the fact that Apollo was depicted as someone willing to force himself onto a woman shows a clear lack of understanding of the very character the author is writing about, likely because they heard the Daphne myth once and thought, well, he literally didn't listen to her when she told him no and kept pursuing her to the point the only way she could escape him was to literally turn into a tree. Ignoring the fact that Apollo only did that because he was shot with a love arrow by Eros, while Daphne was shot with a lead arrow, which would have made her reject the affections of anyone, even someone she previously loved, and that both their actions were beyond their control and reason. Eros purposely set him up for loss and suffering. Apollo was as much a victim in that situation as Daphne was, and his crime, as well as the lesson in that myth, was underestimating Eros' abilities as an archer just because his arrows weren't as lethal as Apollo's, and not realizing that Eros had his own strengths. And yet, young readers or people who are unfamiliar with the source material will still come away thinking that the author's depiction is true to the actual myth, because you think people would really do that? Go on the internet and tell lies? Indeed. Why would they make that up? Well, perhaps to distract from the power imbalance and red flags in the central relationship the comic revolves around, by giving the readers a comically evil character that would make Hades seem like the better choice by comparison. I understand needing a villain for your story, but at the same time, when you are retelling a myth, you do not get the same creative freedom to do whatever you want. I could at least forgive Song of Achilles for rewriting Thetis and Deidamia as antagonists in a story about Patroclus and Achilles' love, because there is some rationality behind it. Meanwhile, Lore Olympus chose Apollo seemingly at random without doing any deeper research about him past a single Google search of who is Apollo. Perhaps they saw Apollo in his depiction in Percy Jackson, didn't like him, and decided Rick Riordan's original series based on Greek myth was perfectly trustworthy and reliable as source material. Using Apollo for this particular plot point of Persephone being subjected to an incredibly traumatizing experience is probably the worst decision, because not only did they have a much more balanced power dynamic in actual myth, Apollo was never even part of Persephone's story. But you know who Persephone does get intimately involved with outside of Hades, where the lines of consent are murky? Zeus. Zeus would have been the more lore-accurate choice to use for this plot point and would serve the narrative in a better way for why Persephone couldn't have refused him. Not only is Zeus not stated to be related to Persephone in this retelling, as he was Persephone's father in the myths, he is also the king of the gods. His power dynamic with Persephone would have been identical to the power dynamic she has with Hades, and so there is a much stronger comparison to be made between the two. Refusing him has far greater consequences than refusing Apollo, who is more Persephone's equal than Hades would ever be, such that drawing comparison between him and Hades is simply laughable. It is a senseless decision, and even calling it a fanfiction of Greek myth would be an insult to fanfictions everywhere. I also mentioned Percy Jackson in passing, and as perhaps the most well-known Greek myth retelling, I should discuss it too. While I am also not a fan of the portrayal of the gods and myths, Percy Jackson is a bit more tolerable to me simply because it is an original story and an original concept. It relies heavily on Greek mythology, as retellings do, but it is set in a completely different era, which already puts distance between it and the original source material, giving it more creative freedom to create new lore and take the story wherever the author wants to go. I would argue a story like Percy Jackson also involves much more creativity than a mere retelling of a myth, because it is telling a story that hasn't previously been told before and builds upon its source material, as opposed to retroactively changing what is already established. The Percy Jackson books ask, what happens next? As opposed to, here's what should have happened, and for that, I can respect it. However, Percy Jackson commits a cardinal sin that is a bit harder for me to consider it a respectful retelling, and it's the removal of the myths from their roots. Percy Jackson is set in the United States of America, as Rick Riordan is American, and callously considers it the new center of Western civilization, as though Greece was defunct. And I don't know if Greece was ever really the center of Western civilization at any point in time, and so he sets about Americanizing the myths, which, while probably makes it more accessible to young Americans learning about them for the first time, also disrespects its origins by writing it out of the narrative to begin with. I imagine that as a Greek person, this feels the same way that Indonesians felt when J.K. Rowling used Indonesian mythology to create a backstory for Nagini, who is allegedly a Naga, which would make her ethnically Indonesian, and then casting a Korean woman to play her and giving no tribute or acknowledgement to those origins other than a tweet. Feels bad, man. So at what point does Deidamia stop being Deidamia and Persephone stop being Persephone? At what point does Greek mythology even stop being Greek? When does a retelling of a character simply become the author's original character meant to serve a very specific purpose in the story? Does it even matter at all? When Homer has been dead for almost 3,000 years and his works are in the public domain anyway? Well, yeah. In the same way people feel upset over movie adaptations of modern book series being unfaithful to the source material, they're also allowed to feel the same towards ancient classics. In the Song of Achilles, the choice to portray Achilles in this way was deliberate. It serves to personalize the focus of the story to Patroclus' limited and biased perspective. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but when it comes to retelling stories already told in great detail, classical ones at that, it risks skewing the perspectives on the source material, which is far less palatable to modern standards and may mislead those unfamiliar with the original iteration. In Achilles' case specifically, it necessitates people to create distinctions between Song of Achilles, and Iliad Achilles, when perhaps the intention of Miller's retelling was to indicate that there is no distinction between the monster that is Achilles and the person Patroclus perceives him to be, that they are one and the same, simply viewed from the perspective of different narrators. And by this point, you're probably tempted to tell me that Song of Achilles is a wonderful story on its own, but not so much as an adaptation of the Iliad. So then I must ask, why isn't it an original story to begin with? Why did it need to use the premise, characters, and main plot of an already existing and widely acclaimed IP, especially when its goal was not to expand upon what was already there and add to it, but rather revise and rewrite its very contents? To which we get the question, when should a retelling be its own original story that is simply inspired by the source material? Perhaps like the Percy Jackson books. I'll try to answer that by explaining why I am fond of the Hades game, but not Song of Achilles. Aside from my own negative view towards Achilles and his story, as I knew him from the Iliad first, it's simply because whereas Song of Achilles is a retelling of a story already told many times before, in great detail in various media, and changing it in ways that make certain characters worse off, Hades is a completely original story written about Zagreus, a god that was largely unknown and for which there was very few literature and or stories about, with whom they were able to create a character that is fully palatable to the modern age while giving themselves the freedom to create a unique new setting inspired by the source material, and write whatever story they wanted without the burden of a legacy behind it. When the game changes things, it's to make a character appear in a better light by modern standards, and this is done equally to every character, even the ones who are supposed to be the villains and antagonists. There aren't any characters in particular that the game decides would be the villains of the story, even if they may stand in Zagreus' way, but neither are they completely sanitized of their vices and wrongdoings. And that is the key word here: originality and respect towards the source material, no matter how flawed it was. Hades didn't try to fix the characters, because when you are retelling a story, first and foremost, you are upholding a legacy and certain expectations. If you are retelling a myth, you have the added pressure of paying respect to the culture the myth belonged to, especially when you are someone outside the culture that myth originated from. No matter how much research you do, you will never fully grasp the significance or nuance of something, the why that a certain thing is significant, as opposed to just that it is, unless it is something you grew up with and were part of. And so, if these stories were to be completely separated from the IP they've attached their names to, because they are different enough to stand on their own merit if you change the names and the setting, would it have received the attention and acclaim that it did? And for this one, I already know the answer to, and it's no. There's an advantage to attaching yourself to a bigger IP. That's how I got my start. That's how most YouTubers and artists got their start, by making content on a topic that is already popular, a trend that's already going viral, that already has an established fan base that wants more. It's common knowledge that if you made fan art of popular ships, popular shows, or games, that if you wrote fanfiction of your favorite ship and made videos about popular movies or popular people, you would grow a following much faster than if you tried to do so with original content. In fact, that's how Disney got its start as well, by retelling fairy tale classics like Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and Cinderella. That's not to condemn creators for doing the same, because frankly that'd be hypocritical of me, because 85% of the time, true creatives would much rather be known by their original work too. But that simply isn't what will get them an audience at the start unless you are very, very lucky. Humans seek what is familiar because, as our evolution dictates, familiarity is safety. We don't tend to prefer stepping out of our comfort zones if we don't have to, and this also reflects in the type of media we consume. Oftentimes, we gravitate to names and IPs we already know, movies we watched growing up, actors we already know we like, and are less likely to give original stories and new creatives a try. That's why Disney has predominantly been producing sequels and live-action adaptations of their own properties, which in itself were retellings as well, as opposed to creating new original work. Because as much as people would preach about wanting something new, something original, they are also less likely to pick up a completely original story as they would a retelling of a property that is already popular or that is based on something else. And so perhaps my advice to you watching this video, if you made it this far, is to consider browsing through original work tag on your media consumption website of choice. Perhaps look for an original comic, an original piece of writing, or even an original series, and give it a try. Perhaps if we actually show interest in original series, the trends will follow, and will finally give power back to creativity, as opposed to needing to appeal to popularity. And that's why I don't like myth retellings. Thank you so much for hanging out in my channel for a while. I hope your skin didn't get too pruny. Let me know if you'd be interested in more videos like this, where I pick a random topic that I didn't realize I had so many thoughts on. Big shout out to my lovely sea bunnies on Patreon. If you want to become a sea bunny and get extra perks like a free commission from me, join my Patreon. If you want to see more from me, then please follow me on all my social media. If you want to submit fan art or chat with me, join my Discord server. And if you want more of my stories, check out my Wild Word series here on YouTube because that will make me really happy. All the links are in my description, and I will see you all in the next video. Goodbye!